There's a kind of quiet that only Montana knows. Not silence, never silence. The wind still combs through the tall grass. The horses still shuffle and stamp in the corral. Somewhere out past the tree line, a lone meadowlark sings once and then goes quiet like it said all it needed to say. But underneath all of it, underneath the groan of a fence post leaning in the breeze, underneath the low rumble of thunder gathering behind the far mountains, there's a stillness so deep it settles into your chest the way warm bread does after a long day's work. Elias Hargrove had lived on that land his whole life and never once thought to question the shape of it. He mended fences because fences didn't mend themselves. He was up before the sun because cattle don't care whether a man slept well. He ate supper alone at a table built to seat 6 because the house had gone quiet the year his mother passed, and it had stayed that way ever since. Quiet in a way that open sky and prairie wind never quite managed to fill. He wasn't a man who thought of himself as lonely. He told himself that enough times that most days he nearly believed it. Then, on a Thursday in late May of 1887, a woman drove a buckboard wagon down his stretch of road, sank one wheel clean into a mud hole, climbed down without so much as a sigh of complaint, and started hauling lumber out of the wagon bed like she'd spent her whole life doing exactly that. Her name was Margaret Calloway. Everyone who knew her called her Maggie, though it would be a while yet before Elias earned the right to. She was 40 years old, steady as still water, and completely, utterly unbothered by him. From that moment forward, Elias Hargrove didn't stand a chance. She never once asked for help. That was the first thing he noticed about her before the auburn hair going silver at the temples that caught the afternoon light, before the calm line of her jaw, before the hem of her gray traveling dress already stained with mud from the road. What struck him first was that she didn't shout, didn't wave her arms, didn't do a single one of the things people usually do when they're hoping somebody will come running to their rescue. She simply got to work. He'd been out repairing a section of the west fence when he spotted the wagon rounding the bend. He watched it slow. He watched the front wheel drop into the rut left behind by last week's storm. He watched the whole rig tip sideways with a groan of straining wood. He set his hammer down in the grass and waited to see what she'd do. She climbed down from the wagon seat with the careful, practiced movements of someone who had long ago stopped trusting the ground beneath her feet. She walked around back, pulled the canvas cover aside, and began unloading planks of lumber one at a time, stacking them neatly on the dry grass at the edge of the road. Elias crossed the field toward her. "Ma'am." She looked up without a flicker of surprise, eyes the color of river stone, gray, calm, giving nothing away. She took in the sight of him in a single, unhurried glance, and something in her expression shifted just slightly, like a door being eased quietly closed rather than slammed shut. "Afternoon," she said, even though it was still well shy of noon. "Morning, actually," he said. She glanced up at the sun, considered it for a moment, and gave a small nod of correction. "Morning." Then he crouched beside the sunken wheel and pushed his hand into the mud around the axle. Deep, but not hopeless. He set his shoulder against the wagon frame. She took up the reins without being asked, climbed back onto the seat, clicked her tongue at the horse, and waited. It took 2 attempts. On the second, the wheel tore free with a wet, sucking pull, and the wagon rolled forward onto solid ground. She looked back at him, mud streaked up his forearm, breath even and unbothered. "Thank you," she said. "I don't suppose you can tell me how much further to Larkspur Hollow." "About 1.5 miles. I'm the new school teacher there, if you're wondering why I've got half a schoolhouse in my wagon bed." He nodded once. Road splits up ahead. Bear right at the fork. She studied him a beat longer than politeness required. Then she climbed back down and started reloading the lumber into the wagon. He picked up the other end without being told to. "Before we follow Elias and Maggie any further down this road, if the pace of this one is already settling into you nice and slow, go ahead and tap that subscribe button and drop a like below. Doesn't cost you a thing, and it tells us you want more stories exactly like this one. Now, let's see if this school teacher makes it to town without looking back even once." She did look back, just once, right before the road curved behind a stand of aspen, and the wagon would have vanished from sight for good. She turned only her head, not her whole body, and there he was, still standing at the fence line, hammer already back in his hand, already working again. He didn't wave, neither did she. She faced forward and kept the horse moving steady. She told herself it didn't mean a thing. A decent young man being decent on an empty stretch of road. That was all it was. Montana had no shortage of decent young men. Boys, more like most of them. She'd owned boots older than 25. She nearly smiled at the thought. Nearly. Larkspur Hollow turned out smaller than the letter from the county board had led her to expect. One main street, a dry goods store, a church that doubled as the town hall on Sundays when there was business to discuss. And at the far edge of town, a one-room schoolhouse badly in need of new paint and even more badly in need of a working door latch. Her landlady, a sharp-eyed widow named Mrs. Bennett, took one look at her trunk and said, "You've done this before, moved around some." "A few times," Maggie said, running towards something or away from it. "Neither. I go where the work takes me." Mrs. Bennett left a pitcher of water and a slice of cornbread on the dresser and shut the door softly behind her. Maggie sat on the edge of the narrow bed. Outside the window, the Montana evening was folding itself in, purple and gold spilling down over the ridgeline, the first stars just beginning to show themselves. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A screen door slapped shut. Someone, somewhere, was frying onions for supper, ordinary sounds. The sounds of a town carrying on with its life, with no particular room in it reserved for her. She had arrived in towns like this 11 times before, always the newcomer, always the school teacher, always the capable, dependable woman that nobody quite thought to invite to Sunday supper, because surely a woman like that already had somewhere to be. She ate the cornbread by herself. It was good cornbread. She made a point of not thinking about the man at the fence. She only half succeeded. He came into town 4 days later carrying a sack of nails he genuinely needed, by way of a route that was genuinely not the shortest one available to him. He was stepping out of the dry goods store when he very nearly collided with her on the boardwalk outside, a supply list in one hand and an expression of mild irritation aimed at a barrel of flour that weighed considerably less than what she'd paid for. "That's 38 pounds, not 45. She was informing the store clerk, a boy of about 16, who was clearly not used to being corrected in quite that tone. "Yes, ma'am," the boy mumbled, and disappeared back inside. She turned and found Elias standing 6 feet away. Surprise crossed her face first, then settled quickly into composure, smooth as a curtain drawn evenly shut. "I never did learn your name." "Hargrove, Elias Hargrove, Miss Calloway." A pause. "Though I expect you already knew that. Word travels fast in a town this size." A faint smile there and gone like a cloud shadow sliding over open field. "Nails," he said, holding up the sack. "For the fence. Same one." She raised an eyebrow. "It's still giving you trouble?" "Fence posts rot. That's just the nature of things out here." She seemed to weigh that. "I suppose it is." The flower boy returned with a corrected receipt. She checked the figures, signed her name, and turned back to Elias as though she'd never stopped being aware of him, which he suspected was closer to true than not. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hargrove, Miss Calloway." She walked off at an unhurried pace, and he stood there on the boardwalk a moment longer than was strictly necessary. He decided, right then, that he'd probably need more nails again next week, too. September arrived, cold and gold, and it found Elias Hargrove standing in his barn at dusk, talking to his horse. This wasn't new behavior for him. He'd been talking to horses since well before he'd mastered talking to people. What had changed was the subject matter. "She looked at me again today," he told the mayor, who happened to be over for supper and was thus a captive audience. "Sunday, same as last week." The mayor didn't say anything. "I know how this looks," Elias went on. "I know what the whole town's whispering. Mrs. Bennett's already got opinions, I'd wager." He leaned back against the stall post, arms crossed, staring at nothing in particular. "Doesn't change what I feel when she's near me, though. Doesn't change that she's the most honest person I've ever come across in this whole county. Doesn't change that she laughed out loud last Tuesday, and I haven't stopped thinking about the sound of it since." The mayor shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "She's 40 years old," Elias said quietly, testing the words for their weight. "And I'm 25. I know exactly how that sounds. I'm not a fool." He paused. "But I've run this ranch by myself since I was 19. I've made harder calls than most men twice my age ever have to make. I buried my father without falling apart. I got the herd through 2 winters that should have wiped me out. I've never once asked anybody for anything I couldn't justify asking for. He pushed off the post and picked up the feed bucket. So I've been asking myself one question. Not what this town thinks. Not even what she thinks right now, because right now, she's still deciding. He set the bucket down. The question is whether she's worth waiting on. He looked at the mayor's square. She is, he said. That's really the whole of it. He went back up to the house, ate alone at a table built for 6, and for the first time since his father had passed, he looked at the 5 empty chairs without feeling that old familiar weight settle over him. He looked at them and thought, quietly. Not always. He allowed himself just that much. One thought, not always, then he washed his plate, banked the fire, and turned in, because the herd still needed him at first light, and patience, he'd learned, never once meant standing still. She told herself she wasn't watching for the road, but she knew the sound of his wagon by then, the particular rhythm of the wheels, the gait of the horse, and when it rolled past the schoolhouse that Friday afternoon around 4, she set her chalk down and looked out the window anyway. He didn't stop. Good, she told herself. That was good. She wasn't a woman given to foolishness. She'd tried that once, back in Ohio at 28, with a man who had wide shoulders, an easy smile, and no intention whatsoever of staying put. She had believed things she had no business believing, and the lesson had landed hard and stayed with her. Self-reliance wasn't a consolation prize for a life that hadn't gone the way she'd hoped. It was armor. And armor was the only thing that had kept her upright ever since. She turned back to the blackboard. 40 years old, a teaching certificate, 11 towns behind her, and a life that ran perfectly well on its own. The children here were sharp. The town was peaceful. Mrs. Bennet made excellent cornbread. That, she told herself, was more than enough. The church held a social that Sunday, and Maggie brought a spice cake because it was expected of her, and meeting expectations in a brand new town was simply the efficient thing to do. Elias stood near the fence at the edge of the churchyard, a little apart from the ranchers, arguing over cattle prices, a tin plate balanced in one hand, looking entirely at ease in his own company. He caught sight of her across the yard and gave her one nod, the same nod he'd given her out on the road that first day. Your presence is a fact I've accepted, and I intend to go on accepting it. She nodded back. Mrs. Bennet materialized at her elbow with the energy of a woman who found quiet deeply suspicious. You've met Elias Hargrove, then? Once or twice? Good boy, steady. Been running that ranch on his own since his father died. A meaningful pause. Young, of course. Very, Maggie said. Mrs. Bennet smiled and said nothing further, which was somehow worse than if she had. Maggie ate her cake and did not look across the yard again. She looked twice, actually. He asked her to walk with him on a plain Sunday afternoon. No moonlight to hide behind. No borrowed nerve. Just clear blue sky and prairie wind and half the congregation 20 yards off eating pie. He simply came and stood beside her near the split-rail fence and said, quiet and even, care to walk a stretch? There's a fine view of the valley from the rise past the creek. She looked at him. He looked back. No expectation in it. No performance. Just a plain question. People will talk, she said. Probably will. She considered the cake on her plate. The short walk, Mrs. Bennet's face out of the corner of her eye. All right, she said finally. They walked. He didn't say much, and she found she appreciated that about him. At one point, he pointed up toward a hawk riding the wind currents above the ridge and said, Red tail? Been nesting up there since I was a boy, near enough. She watched it circle. You grew up out here. Born in that ranch house, never had much reason to leave it. Does that ever trouble you? He gave the question real thought before answering. No. Some folks need to go looking for what they want. I always figured what I needed was already right here. I just had to take proper care of it. Below them, the valley stretched out in every shade of green and gold, the creek catching light in the middle distance, the town sitting small and settled at the far edge of it all. It's beautiful, she said. Yes, he said. But when she glanced sideways, she found him looking at her. Not the valley at all. Mr. Hargrove. Elias. Mr. Hargrove, she said again, firm but not unkind. I am 40 years old. I know that plainly. I'm 25. I know that plainly too. She exhaled slowly. Then you understand why this walk is only a walk. Yes, ma'am. A beat passed. Still a fine walk, though, he added. She kept her eyes forward on the valley, the mountains, the hawk still tracing its slow, patient circles in the high afternoon air. She did not smile. She very nearly did not smile. He left a basket of apples on the schoolhouse steps early one Monday morning, before she'd even arrived. No note. Just the basket, the fruit, and the pale gold light of an autumn morning. She stood there looking at it for a long moment before carrying it inside and setting it on her desk. When young Tommy Reed came in and asked, "Miss Calloway, where'd all them apples come from?" She simply said, a neighbor was feeling generous and let the matter rest there. She kept 2 apples for herself and returned the basket to his ranch that Saturday. It was only proper you return a borrowed basket. That was manners, not meaning. The ranch house was well tended, the fences freshly mended, the barn solid, real glass set in every window. He came out wiping his hands on a rag, and when he saw her, he went still for just a beat, the way he sometimes did, as if making certain of what he was seeing before he let himself respond to it. "I brought a pie," she said. "Can't very well hand back an empty basket." "Come on in, then. I'll put the coffee on." She hesitated on the wagon seat. This was the moment, and she recognized it with the same clear-eyed certainty she recognized most hard truths. Walking through that door would make something between them stop being deniable. Not because anything improper would happen inside, but because sitting across a table from a man, sharing something you'd made with your own 2 hands, that was a choice. That meant something whether or not either of them said so out loud. She climbed down. "I can only stay the hour." "That'll do just fine," he said. He held the door open. She walked through it. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and fresh coffee and something else, too, something that felt, against her own better judgment, like a room that had been waiting a long while for someone to finally put it to proper use. They stayed 2 hours. She didn't even notice the time slipping until the light in the room shifted from gold to amber. She looked up from the empty pie tin, the cold coffee, a conversation that had wandered from her students to the weather, to his father's land, to her own long string of towns she'd never quite managed to call home. 2 hours. She looked down at her hands. "I should be going." "I know," he said. Neither of them moved right away. "Elias," his name said plainly, for the first time. Something small shifted in his face, and he recovered it just as quickly. "What is it you think this is? 2 people who happen to be good company for one another. That's all it is." "That's not nothing," he said quietly. "In my experience, that's the very thing most folks go their whole lives never finding." She looked at him across the table, this broad-shouldered, dark-eyed young man who had never once told her anything but the plain truth. "Sunday," she said finally, "come for supper. I'll do the cooking this time." He held her gaze steady.
"Yes, ma'am."
She drove home in the early dark, and the Montana quiet wrapped itself around her like something she hadn't realized, until just then she'd been missing. Winter came down over Larkspur Hollow in November, and it arrived the way Montana winters always did, not gradually, but all at once, as though the mountains had simply made up their minds and the valley below had no say in the matter. The first snow fell on a Tuesday, quiet and total, blanketing the rutted road and the bare aspens and the schoolyard in white so clean it looked like the whole world had been handed a second chance at itself. Maggie stood at the schoolhouse window and watched it come down. She was aware, with the same careful precision she brought to most things, that she was happy, not merely content, not merely managing the way she'd spent so many years managing. Happy, plainly and uncomplicatedly, in a way she hadn't let herself be since long before Ohio, since before the man who never stayed, before she'd learned to keep the door of herself latched shut for her own protection. The supper had happened, then another one after that, then a Sunday ride up to the rise above the creek, the valley spread white beneath them, their breath fogging in the cold air, Elias pointing out the hawk's empty nest tucked into the high branches. "Gone south for the season," he said. "She'll be back, come March." He said it plainly. The way a man reports on the comings and goings of an old friend. She had started looking forward to Fridays. She had stopped bothering to pretend to herself that she wasn't. In December, Mrs. Bennet said, without any preamble at all. Over breakfast one morning, he's going to ask you something soon. Maggie set down her coffee cup. Mrs. Bennet, I'm not asking your permission to say it. I'm informing you of a fact. The older woman topped off her own cup. He went and spoke with the Reverend last week. The Reverend mentioned it to his wife. His wife mentioned it to her sister. She sat down across from Maggie. This is a small town, dear. Maggie was quiet a long moment. He's 25, she said. Not as an argument this time, more as something close to wonder. Yes, Mrs. Bennet said. And he's the steadiest man in this entire county, at any age you'd care to name. And you have spent the whole of these last 7 months being careful and sensible and entirely correct. She folded her hands on the table. Tell me, how has that been serving you? Maggie looked out the window at the falling snow. She thought of the empty chairs at his kitchen table. She thought of the hawk's nest tucked into the high branches. She'll be back in March. Well enough, she said. But she was smiling when she said it. He asked her on a Thursday evening in January, with the temperature well below freezing and a hard wind coming down off the mountains strong enough to rattle the schoolhouse windows in their frames. He'd come by to fix the door latch, which had been loose since October and which he had, apparently, decided that a bitter January evening was the appropriate moment to finally repair. She'd put the kettle on because it was cold outside and he was there, and there was no longer much point pretending that a cup of tea was anything other than an excuse to stretch the hour a little longer. He fixed the latch. He drank the tea. He stood there with his broad shoulders nearly filling the doorframe, hat turning slowly in his hands, and looked at her with those steady brown eyes that had never once, in 7 months, given her a single reason to guard herself against him. I've got something I mean to ask you, he said. I know, she said. A pause. Mrs. Bennet, he said. Half a question. The whole town, apparently. He nodded slowly, something close to amusement, and something close to nerves, both showing plainly on his face, entirely himself in both. Then I'll just ask it straight out. Please, Maggie. Her name, no title attached to it, for only the second time since he'd known her. I know exactly who you are. I know what it cost you to walk through that kitchen door back in September. I know you've got more years behind you than I do, and more scars and a good deal more reason for caution than I've ever had to earn. He held her gaze without wavering. I'm not asking you to stop being careful. I'm only asking you to be careful with me from here on, instead of careful away from me. She was quiet for a long stretch. The wind pushed against the window panes. The lamplight held its small circle of warmth around them both. She thought of Ohio, of 11 towns, of cornbread eaten alone in a dozen different rented rooms. She thought of the valley from the rise above the creek, gold and green and wide open in every direction. She looked at him. You're going to end up with a very stubborn wife, she said. He let out a slow breath, like a man who'd been carefully holding something for a very long time and had only just now allowed himself to set it down. Yes, ma'am, he said. I'm counting on exactly that. He was still holding his hat out in front of him. She reached across and took it from his hands. They married that April, on a Saturday when the valley had finally remembered how to turn green again. The little church was full. Larkspur Hollow was a small town, but small towns show up in force for the things that matter, and this town had quietly decided this was one of those things. Mrs. Bennet sat in the front pew and did not cry, though her handkerchief saw considerable use regardless. Young Tommy sat beside her in a collar that was clearly new and clearly uncomfortable, keeping his eyes fixed dutifully on the front of the church like a boy who'd been told, in no uncertain terms, that this occasion mattered. Elias stood at the front in a dark coat that fit properly across his shoulders, the way a good coat ought to fit a man who'd earned his build through honest work. His hair was combed flat, his beard trimmed close, his brown eyes fixed steadily on the door at the back of the church, patient as ever, because patience was simply the way he moved through the world. The door opened. Maggie walked in alone. There was no one left to give her away, and she'd said as much to the Reverend, who had offered up a few alternatives, each of which she'd declined with polite, unhurried efficiency. She came down the aisle in a dress the color of fresh cream, her auburn hair pinned up with its threads of silver catching the window light. And then, because she was exactly who she was, one loose curl had worked its way free at her jaw despite her best efforts. She carried a small handful of early wildflowers that Mrs. Bennet had pressed into her hands that very morning without a word of explanation needed. She was 40 years old, and she was the single most beautiful thing Elias Hargrove had ever laid eyes on in his life. He told her so that night over a supper neither one of them ate much of, because there was simply too much else demanding their attention. She told him that was a foolish thing to say out loud. He told her he meant every word of it regardless. She looked at him across the table, this 25-year-old man who had fixed her fence and brought her apples, and waited without a single complaint, and asked her plainly, and held the door open, and meant every last thing he'd ever told her. Outside, the Montana spring was arriving in its own unhurried fashion. Inside, for the first time in longer than she cared to count, the table wasn't set for just one. There's no gunfight in this story. No villain lurking in the shadows, no barn burning down at midnight. Just a woman who had taught herself to need nothing from anyone, and a patient young man willing to wait as long as it took for her to remember that needing someone isn't the same thing as being weak. Margaret Calloway rolled into Larkspur Hollow with a trunk, a teaching certificate, and a heart she'd kept locked up tight for the better part of 12 years. Elias Hargrove mended fences and waited, not because he had nothing better to occupy his time, but because he decided, alone in a barn at dusk with only a horse for company, that she was worth every bit of the wait. And that April, in a church filled with people who showed up simply because it mattered, stubborn as prairie root, the both of them, they found out he'd been right all along. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is finally walk through a door they've spent years standing outside of. Montana will teach you that, if you let it. If this story left something warm sitting in your chest today, if you stayed with us all the way to that church door and felt something when it finally opened, then you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel was built for. Go ahead and subscribe, drop a like on your way out, and tell us in the comments, were you rooting for the two of them from the very first page, or did Maggie have to win you over slow? There are plenty more stories where this one came from: wide open country, quiet courage, and love that finds people right when they've finally stopped looking for it. Until the next one.